What's your biggest vulnerability?
You know, it's interesting. When I was homeless, I realized I was very lonely. And I realized one of the reasons I was lonely is because I didn't tell the truth, except for in a notebook that nobody ever read. And I deserved to be lonely because nobody ever got the opportunity to know me, because I learned that being alone made me feel safe. Mm-hmm. But I realized when I was homeless that it actually disconnected me, and it separated me and isolated me to the point where I couldn't feel human connection or joy of connection. And I wanted to change that. And so I very purposefully switched my safety strategy from armor to vulnerability. And I started writing very honest songs, very revealing songs, and taking big risks about being very honest about who I was and saying the truth, that I was homeless, that I was shoplifting, that I was having panic attacks, that I was agoraphobic. And that's what my songs were about. And when I got signed, I decided to keep doing that, because I did notice that in fame, people tend to get put on a pedestal. Mm-hmm. And a lot of celebrities promote this image of perfection, of perfect beauty, of perfect happiness. And it isolates the artist, and it's not honest, because none of us are always happy or perfect. And then it also distances you from the viewer. They feel like you're this perfect piece of royalty, and they can never be like you, and it creates this gap. And I didn't want that. I didn't want a gap between me and my audience, because I was one of them. And so I tried to constantly take myself off of a pedestal and lead with the truth and lead with my flaws. And I did that my whole career, and it ended up saving me. The vulnerability really isn't, that's where safety is to be vulnerable.
Big breakthrough was what?
I didn't start writing songs till I was 16, really just so I could street sing and earn a living on spring breaks. Yeah. My big break was at the end of being homeless. It was about a year of being homeless. I was singing in a coffee shop every Thursday night, just trying to save enough money for a deposit on an apartment, and I got discovered accidentally. A radio DJ had heard about this girl that had a following. It started with 2 people, and then by the end of the year, I had a decent following, and right. He put a bootleg on the radio, and I ended up in the top 10 countdown of a very big station called 91X in San Diego. And labels heard about that, and they started coming down, and limousines started showing up, and they had no idea I was homeless, and they'd be like, you know, they'd take me to these dinners that cost more than I made in my entire life. And then they would say, where can we drop you off? And I'd be like, here, this is nice. Like, this corner's good. And I had a bidding war. Every label tried to sign me. It was very, very surreal. I had no idea something like that could happen for me. And I was offered $1 million signing bonus as a homeless kid. But I had read a book about how the business works, and that's a loan, and you owe the loan back. Right. And I had realized that my happiness was in my authenticity and in my honesty, and that I probably wouldn't make records that would end up on the radio. I was a folk singer at the height of grunge. And so I turned down $1 million signing bonus, and I took a big back end so that if I ever sold a record, I would then earn money. And it saved me, because my record didn't sell for 2 years, and I would have been dropped for sure if I hadn't turned down that signing bonus.
One of the things that has marked your rise to success has been certainly persistence and resolve and determination. From where does that come? Do you think it was inherited? Is it a result of your childhood? You know, everybody has a degree of determination, resolve, persistence. But you have a triple dose of it.
I think part of it was where I was raised. Alaska is a very special place, as you know. It's a pioneer state with pioneer spirit, where people blazed trails. If something had to be done, they had to do it. There was nobody else to get to do it for them. And I was raised in a culture like that, where I had 6 aunts who shoed their own horses, trained their own horses, felled their own trees, built their own homes, but were beautifully feminine and strong. And so when it came to these sink or swim times in my life, like, should I move out at 15 or should I stay with my dad? I was willing to say, I'm going to move out. Part of that might be just my nature, and I think a lot of it was the environment that I was raised in. And I didn't realize how special it was until I came down to the States and saw that a lot of girls don't have the opportunity to be taught that they're capable and that they're intellectually as capable as a man. I might not be as physically strong, but I'm as capable and I'm clever, and I can figure out a way to do it, even if it's a different way of getting it done. And then all the bar singing. It taught me to look out for myself. It taught me never to use my sexuality as leverage. It taught me to use my wit. to disarm and work situations and to be taken seriously. And those were great lessons leading into the record business, important lessons.
Much of what you've written, both in your music and in your poetry, is confessional. What at core are you confessing?
I wanted to document an honest life. When I was a young girl growing up in Alaska, I didn't have access to much television, but I had access to books. And I really appreciated the writers that were honest, that didn't use art as propaganda to make themselves seem more perfect than they were.
Right.
And so I was drawn to artists like Bukowski and Anais Nin, not because I wanted to be them or live their lifestyles, but because I really appreciated the courage that it took to say their flaws along with their talents. And that made me feel more hopeful as a young child that maybe there wasn't something wrong with me. Because when you look through those magazines and you see pretty perfect people, you just feel alienated. And so I made a promise when I was quite young to write honestly and to never use my art as propaganda. And I try to stay true to that my whole career.
Now back to the question. What are you confessing? What's your biggest confession as a person?
Yeah. It's changed over the years, depending on what I'm working on. In the beginning, it was really just how lonely and afraid I was. Talking about panic attacks that I was stealing, things that felt very shameful to me at the time. Now those don't really carry any shame for me, but at the time they were big confessions. In my book, I talk about cycles of abuse and how we have these emotional inheritances that get passed on generationally. And until we learn a new emotional language, we will speak the language we were raised with. And my dad very courageously allowed me to talk about some pretty hard stuff in my book. Not only about the abuse he was raised in, but how he then became an abusive father, much to his horror. But he didn't get to learn a new emotional language. And he had a lot of PTSD, and he turned to alcohol when my mom left to try and calm his anxiety, and then he started repeating the pattern he was raised with. And then the shame cycle kicks in for him. And that's why I moved out when I was so young. My dad amazingly changed in his 50s and taught himself a new emotional language.
Not an easy thing to do.
It's heroic. I think that's one of the most heroic things a person can do is to change, to be willing to take the work and rewire their brain. It's what I wanted to do, and I did that in my early 20s and continue to do it. But to see my dad do it in his 50s and 60s was very touching.
Well, let's go over some biography. You moved to Alaska at a very young age. Give me the backstory.
My family were Swiss immigrants. They were the last to leave Europe before the Second World War. They were living in Germany. They homesteaded in Alaska. And my dad, was born back in Switzerland during a trip they took back home. And then they moved back to Alaska, living off the land, no electricity, no grid. My grandfather went on to be a senator, actually, for the state and helped draft the Alaska Constitution, which is a pretty amazing immigrant story. And my dad went away to school to have me. Then I was just born while he was in school. And then we moved back to Alaska once he graduated, and I was in Alaska the rest of my life. My mom left when I was 8. My dad also became abusive and began drinking at that age, and I moved out at 15. I knew statistically kids like me should end up repeating the cycle. So I knew statistically kids like me should end up in a ditch or on drugs or in an abusive relationship, and I was determined not to be a statistic. And I paid rent, and I worked hard, and I studied people, and I learned to find new mentors, to learn new emotional languages. And then fast forward 3 years, I wouldn't sleep with a boss. He fired me, wouldn't give me my paycheck. I ended up living in my car. My car got stolen. I became homeless. I started shoplifting. I started having panic attacks. And I looked in the mirror one day while I was stealing something, and I went, I am a statistic. I didn't beat the odds. And I had to do something about it. And that was really a very pivotal time in my life, and when I really started to turn my life around.
You decided you needed to do something about it. And what did you do?
I remembered this quote by Buddha that said, happiness does not depend on who you are or what you have, it depends on what you think. And I had the strange privilege of being stripped of everything but what I thought. But I was so anxious, and anybody that's ever suffered from tremendous anxiety knows that you actually can't track your thoughts in real time. They scatter. And so to try and remedy that, I started to invent exercises for myself, one of which was watching my hands. And I would just watch my hands because they're the servants of your thoughts. So if you want to know what you're thinking, watch what your hands are doing, because it's your thought cooled down into action. And so I started taking notes. How many times did I steal? How many times did I shake hands? How many times did I open doors? How many times would I not shake hands? I deduced that I quit believing in myself. I quit thinking I could earn $40. I quit thinking that I could hold a job down. So that was important to see, but there was a tremendous side effect that when I journaled in real time and witnessed myself in real time, my anxiety calmed down. And then I learned so much about fear that year, that fear is this thief. And it takes the past and it projects it into the future. And it robs you of the only moment you have to create change, which is right now. And so then my life's work became, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And if I could rephrase that just a tiny bit,
sure,
ever so humbly, I would say I perceive what I think, therefore I am. And so I learned that if I could perceive I was sad, I was something other than sad. I was the observer of sad.
right.
When you're the observer of your brain, that suddenly puts you in the driver's seat of a very cool machine. So it makes your brain more like a steering wheel, not a driver. And a lot of us confuse those two. We think our brain is the driver, when actually we're the observer of that brain. And our brains are these amazing tools, but they're these binary computers that have neurological wiring and patterning, and they get trained, and you can retrain them. And so a lot of my life's work was about how do I retrain specific patterns I was taught. And so when I got discovered, my life's goal wasn't to be famous or rich, it was to be a happy person. And then my second job was to try and figure out how to be a musician. And I tried to stay true to that my whole career.